A blizzard swept across the Colorado mountains like it was ready to swallow everything whole. Owen Croft sat by the fire holding a cup of cold coffee when he suddenly jumped at the sound of knocking. 3 knocks, soft and shaky. Owen frowned. Who in the world would be outside in the middle of a storm like this? He grabbed his rifle, walked to the door, and cracked it open. A blast of freezing wind rushed in, carrying snow, and a single figure shivering in the whiteout. A Chinese woman. Her clothes were torn and tattered. Her black hair clung to her face. Her bare feet were bluish and crusted with dried blood. Her face was hollow, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She stood as straight as she could, her voice rough and raspy. "Please, let me come into your house to get warm. I have not eaten in days. Everyone has turned me away and abandoned me." Owen stood frozen. The firelight flickered across his face, a face that had known loss, and now stared straight into someone else's misery. Part of him wanted to shut the door, to stay alone in the solitude he knew so well. But then he saw her eyes, wild, terrified, and starving, and his hand trembled. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in," the woman stumbled in. When the door shut behind her, the howling storm seemed to be locked outside, and inside the cabin all that remained was the shaky breath of a soul trying to cling to its last bit of warmth in a merciless winter. The fire in the stove crackled back to life, pushing away some of the cold that had been gnawing at the wooden cabin. Owen tossed in a large log. The flames caught quickly, casting a warm golden glow on the pale, dirt-smeared face of the woman. Her name, Owen would later learn, was Leanne. She sat as close to the stove as she could, removing a wet, tattered blanket from her shoulders. She was trembling all over, her lips dark purple, and every breath she took sounded like a sigh from the edge of death. Owen poured hot water and set down an old iron pot in front of her. Inside, he stirred what little he had left, some stewed beans and broken bits of cornbread. It was the same meal he had been stretching for himself all winter. Leanne stared at it as if she could not believe it was real. When Owen nodded, she began to eat quickly with shaking hands, as if afraid the food might vanish before it reached her lips. He sat across from her in silence, holding his cup of coffee, watching. It had been a long time since this cabin felt alive. No longer just the wind, now there was another breath, the clink of a spoon against the pot, and the soft hiss of the fire. When she finished eating, Owen stood and brought out a thick blanket from the bedroom. He gently laid it across her shoulders. "Stay the night. We will figure things out in the morning." Leanne looked up at him, her eyes strong but tired. "I will leave early. I do not want to bother you, but thank you for not closing the door." Owen said nothing. He had just noticed the dark bruises on her wrists. Rope burns. He stood still, realizing she had not only been starving, she had been abused. As she drifted to sleep beside the stove, she spoke in a choked, half-conscious voice. "The men from the railroad camp, they said I bring bad luck. When the sickness came, many people died and they blamed me." Owen stayed silent. Outside, the blizzard was still howling, but inside him, a different sound had awakened, the sound of compassion, something buried since the day he lost his wife and child. He stood, added more wood to the fire, then spoke softly, his voice dry and rough like old timber. "Stay. Leave when the skies are clear." Leanne, half asleep, seemed to nod, a single tear escaping her eye. That night, Owen lay on the long bench, listening to the steady breathing of the stranger sleeping by his fire. The wind still howled outside, but for the first time in years, it no longer sounded lonely. The next morning, the sky was still a dull grey, and the snow had piled up all the way to the fence. Owen opened the door, and a blast of cold air hit him, making him pull his collar tight around his neck. He had planned to wake the woman and send her on her way before the blizzard returned. The small cabin did not have enough food for 2 people, and Owen was not used to having anyone else in his world. But as he approached the stove, Owen froze. Leanne was curled up on the floor, her body trembling violently. Her face was flushed red, and her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. Owen gently touched her forehead. It was burning hot. "A fever," he said softly to himself. Her ordeal had finally caught up to her. He looked at the woman in front of him, starving, exhausted, but still holding on to her dignity even in sickness. He let out a long sigh and set his rifle down. He couldn't send her out like this. From that day on, the once silent cabin began to echo with soft footsteps and the quiet hum of life. Owen took care of Leanne, giving her water and keeping the fire roaring. He managed to make a thin broth from the last of his beans. As she recovered her strength, Leanne took over the cooking. Even with nothing more than dried beans, a little cornmeal, and spring water, she managed to make meals that smelled of wood smoke and made Owen enjoy eating again for the first time in years. Soon, she was helping him outside, chopping firewood and fixing up the horse stall. Her hands were rough but steady, every swing of the axe firm and confident like someone who had spent her life in the wilderness. Owen was quietly surprised to see a woman handle hard labor as well as he did. As the days faded into one another, trapped by the relentless snow, Leanne would sometimes sing a quiet folk song from her homeland while she worked. Owen would sit sharpening his knife, silently listening. The singing was faint but sweet, blending with the howling wind outside, creating a sound the cabin had never known before, the sound of life. When night came, Leanne would tend to the fire, then turn to Owen and speak softly. "We will leave when the storm clears, I promise," Owen replied simply, "no need to rush." "Just get better." The firelight danced across their faces, a woman who had been cast out, now sheltered in the home of a lonely man. And in that quiet exchange of glances, something began to change, slowly but deeply. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, rising in long wails like the cries of a pack of wolves. Inside the small cabin, firelight danced across the wooden walls, illuminating the faces of two people sitting in a circle around the stove. It had been 3 days since Leanne's fever broke. She leaned against a post, a faint smile on her lips as she listened to the crackle of burning wood. Owen sat nearby, slowly sharpening a small knife. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. It was Leanne who broke that silence. "I used to live near the new rail line," she said, her voice raspy, her eyes fixed on the fire. "My father worked there. But we were caught between the new settlers and the old anger. One night they came, burned everything. My father was killed. He did not make it out in time." Her eyes shimmered with tears. She paused, taking a deep breath, her voice catching in her throat. "They said I was a curse, that I should not have survived. I was driven out of the camp. Since then, I just kept walking, eating roots, sleeping in the snow." Owen set the knife down and looked at her. The firelight reflected in his grey eyes, a gaze deep and heavy with memory. "I understand," he said softly. "I lost everything, too. It was the sickness. My 2 little ones died in a single week. And my wife, she could not bear it. She followed them soon after." No one spoke again, only the wind outside and the quiet pop of the fire. But in that silence, something shifted, understanding. Leanne looked over at the pot of beans, stirring gently, her voice calm. "I did not think there was anyone left out there who knew what that felt like." Owen looked at her and nodded. "There are too many people in the world who think pain makes you weak. But in truth, only those who survive it know what real strength is." Those words made Leanne lift her head. The firelight caught the depth of her dark eyes. And in that moment, she saw something she had not felt in a long time: trust. They sat like that through the night. No more stories. No need for comfort. But when Leanne looked across at Owen, between two people the world had once cast aside, an invisible bond had formed in the quiet. On the 4th night, the sky darkened all at once. The wind howled through the mountains like the cry of a wounded beast. Blasts of snow began hammering against the cabin walls, dragging in a cold that cut straight to the bone. Owen looked up from his work. The fire in the stove flickered weakly, a sure sign that a real storm was coming. He stood up, threw on a heavy coat, and called out sharply, "Leanne, help me brace the door. If this wind gets any stronger, the walls will tear apart." Leanne said nothing, just stood up and pulled on her cloak. The two of them rushed out to the porch, snow lashing at their faces like tiny knives. The barn door banged wildly in the wind. They fought to hold it, tying it down with ropes and nailing in boards. The wind was so fierce, every step took their full strength. A thunderous crack. A board from the east wall broke loose. Leanne lunged forward, joining Owen to lift it back into place. In a split second, their hands pressed together on the heavy timber beam. Shoulder to shoulder, their skin was freezing, but where their hands met, a strange warmth surged up in the heart of the storm. They worked non-stop for over an hour. When the last door was finally secured, Leanne collapsed onto the porch, her breath pouring out in thick clouds. Owen reached out and helped her up. "Are you all right?" "I used to think I would die in the snow," she said, her voice raw, her lips tinted purple from the cold. But not now. They looked at each other for a long moment. The wind still roared around them, but the cabin stood strong. Back inside, Leanne added more wood to the fire and poured hot water into cups. Owen sat down beside the stove, his eyes quietly following her as she wiped frozen droplets from her hair. She looked up and met his gaze. In that brief moment, there were no strangers, no caution, only two souls who had once been alone, now finding one another in the heart of a brutal winter. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the warmth was stronger than it had ever been, and when Leanne reached out to add another log to the fire, Owen's hand brushed against hers once more. This time, neither of them pulled away. The next morning, the storm had passed. For the first time in days, the sun peeked out, laying golden streaks across the thick, cotton-like snow. The air was so still you could hear the drip of melting water from the cabin roof. Owen stepped onto the porch, his breath rising in mist, one hand resting on the door frame. The world around him was blanketed in pure white, as if the storm had never come, but its traces remained, tilted fences, a few missing boards, and a layer of frost shimmering on the barn. Behind him, soft footsteps echoed. Leanne stepped out, wearing one of Owen's heavy coats. Her dark hair shimmered in the morning light. She gazed out at the wide expanse of snow, her voice low, light as the breeze. "I did not think we would make it through the night." Owen let out a rare smile, one that softened a face weathered by sun and wind. "Every storm passes. You just have to keep the fire burning." That made Leanne turn to look at him. The fire not just in the stove, but within them, that warmth slowly pushing back the long years of solitude. In the days that followed, life inside the cabin began to change. Leanne started tidying things up, laying a cloth back on the table and hanging bunches of dried herbs by the window for scent. She helped Owen care for the horses, sometimes humming old folk songs as she worked. She and Owen repaired the barn roof together. They worked side by side, often silent, yet always understanding. Once when Leanne slipped, Owen caught her with his rough but steady hands. She only managed a quiet, "Thank you," then turned away to hide her smile. At night, the two of them sat around the table for supper. They spoke little, just nodded when Leanne offered more food. The cabin no longer echoed only with wind, but with the soft clink of spoons, quiet conversation, and the crackling of fire. One evening, Leanne stayed by the fire watching the flames. "I used to believe there was no place left for me in this world," Owen answered, his voice low. "There is. You just have to walk through a lot of cold to find it." Outside, the snow was melting slowly. And inside that small wooden cabin in the forest, something had started to grow, peaceful, simple, and so real that even the wind seemed to pause and listen. The snow slowly melted, revealing patches of damp brown earth and a small stream trickling through the field. The early spring air carried the scent of fresh grass and the quiet promise of hope. Owen and Leanne began rebuilding the farm. They chopped wood and added a small room to the side of the cabin, a silent sign that she was no longer just a guest. Leanne planted beans in the freshly turned soil, watered the garden, and tended to the scraggly chickens that had made it through the winter. Laughter, the clucking of hens, the rhythmic sound of hammering all blended together, bringing life back to the land. But then, one early morning, just as the sun crested the horizon, the sound of hooves echoed from a distance. Owen looked up. Sunlight glinted off the wooden fence as 5 riders approached. At the front was the mayor of Pine Creek along with several townsfolk. Their faces were hard as iron. The mayor pulled his horse to a stop at the gate, casting a cold, contemptuous glance toward the Chinese woman standing near the garden bed. "Croft," he called out, loud and sharp. "We heard you have been harboring a foreigner on your land. There is no place for her kind here. She needs to leave now." The air froze. Leanne stood tall, fire in her eyes, but silent. Owen stepped forward and placed his weathered hand on the fence. His voice was calm, low, and clear. "She is not a stranger. She is my family." A ripple of whispers stirred among the riders. The mayor scowled. "Family? Have you lost your mind?" "She is not our kind." Owen did not flinch. "I know. But she saved this farm from the cold. She works. She brings warmth. If she has to leave, then I leave with her." The group stiffened. No one had expected the lone rancher to stand up against the town's decree. Leanne looked at him, surprised, and in her eyes, something deeper began to take root, complete trust. The mayor cleared his throat and spoke slowly. "If you want to keep her, fine. But Pine Creek does not feed idlers. Make the land live again. Plant, raise livestock, harvest something. One season. If it works, she can stay. If it fails, she goes." Owen nodded, his eyes hard as stone. "One season. That is enough." As the riders turned and the dust of their departure hung in the air, Leanne stepped closer and asked quietly, "Why did you say that? Are you not afraid they will come back?" Owen answered, his voice rough as the night wind. "No one has the right to drive my family from their home." Leanne stood still, looking at Owen for a long time. Then she gave a quiet nod. The two of them turned back toward the farm, where dry earth and cold wind waited for them. But this time, they would plant something more than seeds. They would plant trust and the will to survive. That April, Pine Creek had never seen a spring so full of hope. Warm wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of fresh soil, wet wood, and scattered laughter from a small farm where two people were turning ruin into life. Owen rose before the morning mist cleared, calloused hands gripping the hoe. He and Leanne worked tirelessly, digging irrigation trenches, setting fence posts for the cattle, and sealing every leak in the barn roof. Each hammer strike, each drop of sweat felt like a vow to breathe life back into the land that once stood silent. Leanne, in an old patched dress, moved like a warrior. She hauled water and carried straw, her suntanned shoulders flexing under the sky. When Owen tried to help, she just smiled. "I used to climb mountains to find food. This is easier." Owen said nothing, but the warmth in his eyes spoke louder than words. They rebuilt the vegetable garden, planting corn, beans, and squash. At night, her folk songs blended with Owen's harmonica, drifting across the prairie like a prayer. Day by day, green returned. Sprouts broke through dry cracks. The barn echoed with the lowing of cattle again, and the stream down the hill flowed clear, reflecting their growing smiles. One morning, with the golden sun spilling across the fields, riders appeared once again from Pine Creek. The mayor and the townsfolk stopped at the gate, surveying the land. It was no longer dead. Before them stood a living farm, corn as high as a man's shoulder, a barn full of livestock, and chimney smoke curling up from the cabin roof. Owen stepped out, holding his hat, his work shirt stained with soil. Beside him stood Leanne, proud and steady, glowing in the sunlight. The mayor remained silent for a long time, then exhaled deeply. "I cannot believe it." "You actually did it," Owen replied simply, "not me." "We did." Murmurs stirred among the crowd. Their expressions softened. One man tipped his hat. Another tossed a handful of seeds onto the earth, an unspoken sign of acceptance. The mayor gave a small nod, then turned his horse. "She has the right to stay. Pine Creek needs people like you." Once they were gone, Leanne looked at Owen, pressing her lips together to hold back emotion. "So now I am allowed to live." Owen smiled a full, honest smile, the first in many years. Not just live. Live together. That evening, they shared their first meal grown from their own hands. The breeze carried the scent of fresh corn. Smoke rose above the roof, and in the glow of sunset, Owen and Leanne sat side by side. No one said a word. They did not need to, because at last, on this harsh and wild land, they had found a true home.